Hello, everyone. Just giving folks a minute to log on here, watching our numbers go up. We had a lot of registrants for this session, so expecting a few more folks here. Welcome, everyone. Thank you to our team for encouraging everyone to introduce yourselves in the chat box. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Folks will continue to log on, I'm certain, but we have our panelists here with us. So just a administrative note, we are recording this session, and let's see, we'll jump in here. Valerie Grusing, I'm the Executive Director of NHPO. I've been here since the beginning of 2019 and coming to you from my home office in Silver Spring, Maryland. This is the ancestral homeland of the Piscataway and the Nacotchtank peoples. I myself am descended from colonizers, so remain eternally grateful for the opportunity to do this work and to be here with you today. Please do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box. We will not have time for a round robin here today, but want everyone to be sure and do that if you would like to. I'm going to take a moment of sort of self-serving NHPO updates here. Since this is a NHPO workshop, we wanted to let you know to mark your calendars for two upcoming events later in the year. One of them sooner rather than later. We're holding a workshop virtually. This will be a two-part workshop. We have not yet scheduled the second one. The first one will be on June 8th. And we're really excited about this one. We're doing it as part of a grant we received from the National Trust for Historic Preservation on telling the full history. And this is picking back up a project that I worked on a few years ago, along with one of our panelists today, who is not listed, but is part of our recurring cast of experts at this point, Eric Thorsgaard with the BIA. We will be walking folks through a template for tribal data collection that we generated as part of characterizing tribal cultural landscapes, a federally funded project a few years ago. And we are really excited to do that. Of course, it's targeted for tribes, but will be, like most of our events, open for everyone. So stay tuned to our website for registration information on that one soon. Our Sacred Places Summit, second annual this year, will be September 21st and 22nd. And sort of reluctantly, we are deciding to remain virtual throughout the remainder of 2022. You may hear from my little assistant today. We are under a quarantine with our toddler again this week, and our first graders teacher tested positive for COVID yesterday as well. So we are not in the clear yet, and not feeling like it's the right thing to start bringing large numbers of people back together. So that is unfortunate. I had been looking forward to getting out there and meeting a lot of you myself and traveling again, but we will look toward 23 for resuming in-person events. Today's panelist, we are really excited about this webinar. I feel like I say this a lot, but this one sort of came together through a number of conversations we had been having on and off the record and other recent events. And it's going to be a really engaging and lively discussion, and one that I think we will all find useful for various reasons. And we are so glad and honored to have all of these panelists with us here today. Some of them esteemed NATHPO members, and others partners who we are so grateful for and supporting our work. So I will let you read this list to yourself. And first, we're going to turn it over to Gary Cantley, who is the BIA Western Regional Archaeologist, for a quick 101 flyover of Section 106, the basics from the federal perspective. That's going to be the sort of stage setting. Many of you probably will be familiar with what he's going to go through, but we want to do that before we get into sort of riffing on that. And then we'll turn it over to our colleagues from the United Auburn Indian community to present to you a draft guide document that they are working on that represents their perspectives, and we hope will be useful to you on the Section 106 process. And then we will turn it over to our colleagues from the Coeur d'Alene tribe to provide some pro tips from their perspectives. And then we will have a recorded message from our colleague, Mary Barger, who is an archaeologist at Logan Simpson and has been a practitioner in the field for a long time. And that will be about some pro tips related to the NHPA process that she has observed throughout her career as well. And unfortunately, she's not able to be with us in person today, but we are grateful to have her comments and a recorded message. So stop sharing now. I will turn it over to you, Gary. Kick us off.
Okay, now, I need to bring up my PowerPoint, right?
Yes, please.
All right. Okay.
You should be able to share.
I don't see it. Oh, okay, here we go. How's that?
Oh, very good. Perfect.
What do you know? Well, speaking of quarantine, guess where I am in? I tested positive for COVID yesterday.
Oh, Gary.
But I'm going to muscle through it. That's for sure. I'm a minor head cold, minor cough. It's not a big deal, I don't think, right now.
Goodness.
So, but I couldn't miss this. I couldn't miss this. But now, man, I'm intimidated. We got all these great folks on the line, Valerie. I was expecting, well, I didn't know exactly what I was expecting, but gosh. So a lot of people are going to have plenty of opportunity to put something in the chat, things like that, of course, but that's for a purpose. We'll wait until we see the latter part of the presentations today too, okay? So I'm basically kind of giving you a perspective from the federal government. I've been with BIA since 1992 and my regional archaeologist down here in Phoenix since about 1994, okay? And so I've dealt with 106 primarily on Indian land. And so it's a little bit different, say, than how my counterparts at other federal agencies would be, but we follow the same regulations. And so I know there's a lot of people here with a lot of expertise, and I know there's various ways to read the regulations, but we're just gonna, well, we always have to go back on a regular basis to look at the regulations in light of different conditions and stuff like that. But proceeding on, let me tell you this: if you're going to work in Indian country, this is the place to start. The American Indian law in a nutshell. In a nutshell, it's cliff notes for law students, okay? They have tax law, criminal law, civil law in a nutshell. This is a good read. This is an easy way to get introduced to why we exist. Why is the BIA out there? What's our relationship with the Indian tribes? It's BIA, or the federal government's relationship with tribes, is principally one of case law, okay, from my perspective. And so this captures that really well. There are other things out there, of course, some great books, but this is a great start for anybody who may be interested in wondering why BIA is involved in approving leases in the first place and things like that, okay? Glen Canyon Dam. Now, note the National Historic Preservation Act dates to 1966. I have read that this is what precipitated the movement for the National Historic Preservation Act. Glen Canyon Dam up there in northern Arizona, which flooded all kinds of archaeological sites, and it caused a lot of concern among the general population. It's funny, today, in the times of drought right now, a lot of these archaeological sites have been exposed, just as an aside, okay? And they're finding out that they're actually fairly in good condition, as I understand, which is kind of fun, kind of interesting. Okay, I go to this, believe it or not, on a fairly regular basis for direction, okay? And this is something that's in the act, it's in our regulations, and we can see what this, in the act anyway, okay? It's pretty powerful. The people who wrote these regulations did a good job, okay? Historic properties, significant to the nation's heritage, okay? Preservation of this heritage is irreplaceable. It's in the public interest to be maintained, enriched for future generations. I work in Indian country and I hear that quite a bit. Maintain it, enriched for future generations. It dovetails in my mind very well with what tribal leaders, tribal members are trying to do, okay? Thinking about the 7 generations ahead. Here's the deal. The National Historic Preservation Act will not stop a project. Bottom line, okay? What it does is it tells us that we have to stop and consider and look at it, okay? We have to take into account the effects of our undertakings on historic properties. And the regulations, they tell us how we shall meet those responsibilities. Okay. That's all it does. It tells us that you have to stop and consider. But now the regulations say you have to prove that you considered it. And that's perspective, folks, from the federal government. SHPOs, THPOs do not get sued. The federal agencies are the ones who get sued under National Historic Preservation Act because we did not follow the process. And so what we do, a big part of our job as a federal guy, is we want to develop a robust administrative record, okay? And that could be the letters we send back and forth. We like to have letters back from your office too to show concurrence or not. Okay, but ultimately, in the end, we do come up with some resolution for things like that. A good bureaucrat will be taking notes from phone calls or attempts to make phone calls. They'll keep their emails, things like that. If we get sued successfully, we have to pay the lawyer's fees, okay? So that's one reason. Now, the way you do it, I always said, if we ever got challenged and there's some issue that maybe I missed a step or something like that, I would not ever let this go to court. We would step back and we would do the process anew, okay? We're just not going to get in, not under my watch. Here we go. Title 36, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 800, okay? These are the Section 106 consultation part. Section 106 is out of the National Historic Preservation Act. This is the crucial one right here. I typically also deal with Section 110, but that's the 106 process. It's a consultation process that's spelled out. Now, I know a lot of you know this already, of course, but let's just follow along. Now, I'm thinking some federal agencies, their regulations for the National Historic Preservation Act are under different titles where they might not be under 36. But those of us in the Department of Interior, that's where it's at, okay? Here's the steps. Identify historic properties that may be affected by the undertaking. Assess the effects. And then if you can't, avoid it, you want to minimize or mitigate any of those adverse effects. Now here's it is in a nutshell. And I like these flow charts, okay? And this kind of spells out everything here. Initiate the 106 process. I'm going to elaborate on this. This is very, very important, okay, for me. Identify historic properties, click down, assess effects or adverse effects, okay? This is pretty good. Resolve adverse effects. That's where you get into your memorandum of agreements. Failure to agree. Now, I've never been in that situation where you haven't done it, but I'm certainly aware of it. Off reservations typically. But let's just proceed on. Now, here's another. Pay attention to this. You're going to see a good version of this later on, okay? But this kind of clicks down to the same type of things. But I want to note at the very top where we plan to involve the public in that regard, okay? Very similar, but you'll be seeing this again. So use that steel trap and click it in, okay? Thomas King's book there on the left is actually a pretty good read. It's one of the better ones that I've come across. I imagine it's probably been updated since the early days, okay? But the point being is, for those of you who are just getting into being a THPO, there's a good, substantial body of literature out there for you to call upon, okay? And I'm not necessarily promoting Tom King. I'm just letting you know that this was a good read. It was a good place to start, as a matter of fact. I'd highly recommend it. There's others since then too, of course, but this is a good place to start. And if anybody has any recommendations, I would encourage you to put them in the chat room, okay? Appreciate that much. The one on the right, the Park Service, bless their heart, they capture all the historic preservation laws, federal historic preservation laws there in one document. And that's very handy. It's got ARPA, NAGPRA, 106, Antiquities Act, some of the earlier ones, okay? Agency official, that's the federal official who has the ultimate authority about whether or not an undertaking takes place. Undertaking, we're going to talk about that definition here in a second. You can interchangeably say like a project or something like that. That's how I think of it. SHPO, State Historic Preservation Officer, THPO, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. That office was created in the early 1980s when the National Historic Preservation Act was amended to accommodate, to bring in THPOs, which was inspired at that time, okay? Tribal lands, this is important. All lands within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. That is not the same as trust land, okay? All lands within exterior boundaries of the reservation or dependent Indian communities. And what that means is it's been defined by the Supreme Court. It's a catch-all term for everything else that's not in the reservation, okay? Now, I don't know, okay, we've got over 550 tribes in the United States. Over half of those are in the continental lower 48. And so I know we got a lot of variability across the nation about what tribal lands would be. Oklahoma makes my head hurt, okay, every time I think about that. But so it's different, okay? And so we'd have to defer to those folks out there who work with that on a daily basis. But tribal lands is a crucial thing. I come up against that quite a bit. Consulting parties, those are basically the individuals who the federal agency thinks has a stake in the project. Area 8, area potential effects. Now, I like to divide it between like direct and indirect effects, but I understand lately with the Council of the Advisory Council on the National Historic Preservation Act, we don't confer it that way, but direct means where you're going to have that road is directly going to hit the site. Indirect is like a visual effects that road may have on historic properties. That's another place where people could go ahead in the chat and elaborate on that. They're welcome to. Eligibility is that site, object, district potentially eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And there are some criteria that it has to meet, and that too is elaborated in the regulations. The National Register of Historic Places, that's where actually the Park Service, they administer that, and there are a number of them in every state, quite a bit. And what that does is that opens that property up to some substantial tax benefits, plus having the prestige of being on the National Register. We've all seen those plaques. TCP, traditional cultural property. Those of you who are familiar with that, of course, would recognize that came from Bulletin 38, in my mind anyway. And so that's a bulletin, that's a recommendation. They've tried to amend it. And Tom King is one of the primary authors of that. And so he's had some comments about that. And he discusses in that book that I showed y'all earlier. All right. Here's what I do every day, probably 20 times. And my counterparts do probably if they're busy, okay? Do we have an undertaking? That's a crucial thing for us, okay? For there's a lot of projects that happen in Indian land that BIA does not have any interaction with at all. The Natural Resource Conservation Service comes to mind. All they have to do upon doing their project is notify the BIA in the event that it may change the the number of animals that's going to be on a lot that goes through some type of approved range management plan. Okay, all they have to do is notify us in that regard. Indian Health Service, they typically do a lot of work that we don't have any involvement in, unless they want to try to get a right of way or encroachment along one of our highways that's in the BIA system. Okay, but for me, that's one of my first questions is what's BIA involvement? And you could, sometimes it's not so obvious because it may be a 638 funding that's driving that project. Now, as I understand, it's not uniform across the board, but all the 638 contracts I've seen, there's a clause in there that they have to follow the National Historic Preservation Act as well as NHPA. Okay, so. But evidently, again, across the board, nationwide, that might not necessarily apply. Okay, and then there is the delegation or approval by a federal agency. Now, where I've seen that most often is where the Federal Highways Administration, they will delegate down to the Arizona Department of Transportation, Nevada DOT, and Utah. Okay, and so that's the way I see that. Why I see that is because that's the BIA Western region, okay, Arizona, Nevada, Utah. So, but that's worked out there. Establish an undertaking. Is BIA, are we approving something, refunding or anything like that? Where's that happening? So I got to know whether or not there's a SHPO or THPO involved. Plan to involve the public and identify other consulting parties, okay? But before that, I asked the question, does this undertaking have the potential to affect historic properties? Now, we do a lot of things like, and they come across my desk for categorical exclusions, such as probate. Our people will set, or we're going to, an individual is received through the probate process, land, okay, they've inherited it. That comes across my desk, a categorical exclusion. That's a paper shuffle. That has no potential to cause effects to historic properties. Likewise, when we bring land into trust, Again, we consider that to be a paper shuffle. All right. Bring it into trust. All we do is change the land status of that. Okay. Now, the Forest Service, they may have another view on that. It depends. And the reason I say that's based on experience, where they think that comes out of, in one instance, they said that comes out of federal ownership when it's transferred to a tribe. But, you know, it's not technically, that's not true, because the title of that land still belongs to the federal government. But that's a crucial thing. So that's a big decision I have to make. Do we have the potential to affect historic properties? Okay, we do have potential, which is very typical, okay? Well, we are allowed to make it commensurate per the regulations with the level of our involvement, okay? And so some of that allows for some professional discretion on our part. You know, we have a bunch of canals out here on private land that belong to but the canals belong to BIA. And if we were going to give somebody an encroachment permit to do a driveway across that canal, okay, we pay, you know, we make it commensurate with the nature of our involvement in that, okay? So, but now you could say, what if the same encroachment is going to happen 20 times leading out to a 2,000 acre development on private property? Well, that's where we know there's a bunch of archaeological sites out there. Well, that's where we make the call in consultation with the THPO in this particular case, because we're on private property, or we're not on reservation land, okay? So, but determine the scope of effects, identify historic properties. You know, everybody sees the class 1, the background research, consultation, and you know, not all projects are the same. We are allowed to collapse projects into one step, okay? Sometimes that happens very well. You know, if we know the routine, we know the individuals involved, we can collapse a lot of steps into one. We know what we're going to need to do anyway. We need to go out, we're going to do a survey, do the background research. If there's some buildings or something like that that we think may be significant, yeah, we will do some interviews, which I'm very proud of, as a matter of fact. It wasn't my idea, but a consultant came on and they started that type of process too, which has been to good effect. Field survey. Okay, we go out, we find something. Is it eligible for the National Register? Now, this is kind of the first preamble to it, okay? We gotta just define what it is in terms of just, you know, how is it significant? You know, is it still have the integrity or the location, design, setting, okay? Those type of things, that's your first step. And it's easy to think of this in terms of buildings, of course, but there's, you know, archaeological sites, TCPs. As a matter of fact, we do that on a fairly regular basis now. Quality of significance in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. This is where we get the TCPs, is present in districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects. Somebody knows of an object that's been on the National Register or it's eligible, go ahead and list it. It'd be interesting to see. Possess integrity or location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, and association. And here's the crucial things coming up now, these 4. Is it possibly associated with the events? Civil War battles, of course, or something like that. Associated with the lives of persons significant in our past. Valerie Grusing, for example. All right, so that's what it'll be one of these days. Embodied characteristics of the type, method, or period of construction. This is architecture in my mind, bridges, things like that, particularly if it's the only one out there anymore, okay? So distinguished entity. Criterion D, that's the catch-all for archaeological sites, historic sites. Everybody here has seen that one quite a bit, I imagine. Archaeologists go out and they find archaeological sites, okay? That's just how they do it. Events, people, type, archaeological sites. It's kind of how I characterize it. Now, I've seen petroglyphs with criterion C and D, but I've also seen where they have actually done petroglyphs with events or TCPs with the lives of persons significant in our past. I've seen where tribes have made that point where somebody like one of the twins, which is prevalent around the world, you know, persons significant in their past. And so that's it. See, it doesn't have to be on national, it could be on a national, state, or local level that it's important too, okay? And remember that on a local level. So that's where we get with the lives of persons significant in our past. It could be like the hero twins, for example. That's where I've seen that, to good effect, as a matter of fact. Historic property is affected. Okay, let's say we can't avoid it. That's the easy example, okay? Adverse effects found when conditions may directly or indirectly alter characteristics of historic property that qualify it for the National Register, okay? That's the crucial thing for me because again, let's go back to the canals, which are significant in Indian country because that's part of the history, the events, okay? That's where we characterize it, criterion A. But if we're going to do a fiber optic line parallel, or perpendicular to that canal, we're not going to alter the characteristics of that canal that make it eligible for the National Register, okay? And so we always say no adverse effect. That's how that works out. Now, if we're going to mess with the head gates or something like that, well, that's another matter. But the simple way to do this, to express no adverse effect, would be that example right there. Let's make sure I didn't miss anything, okay? But let's say we do have an adverse effect. We can't avoid it. That's when we go ahead and we'll notify the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation. After I've gotten THPO or SHPO concurrence that it is indeed an adverse effect. They always like to see that as part of the administrative record that we send to them, okay? Here's examples. Now, the Advisory Council usually doesn't get involved anymore. They've got in the back of the regulations, you'll see where they've put the criteria they use to determine whether or not they're going to get involved. And if Linda Otero's involved, I see right there, they may. I'm teasing you, Linda. I'm teasing you, okay? Physical destruction. Let's go through some of these right here, okay? Oh, man, this was on my watch. It was able to resolve a road, okay? Now, note here, you know, this fence that's put up all around a BIA building. We had to deal with that alteration of it. I have to worry sometimes about housing improvement projects at Hopi, okay? And these type of old pueblos right here. This is the real deal, okay? And so we don't do adverse effect when we go in there and repair the roof or the floor or anything like that. Now this is a good one though. Visual, particularly visual as opposed to audible elements. Of course, this top of this hill is where the hero twins of the Tohono O'odham Nation came from, okay? So, but this was built in the 1950s. Interesting administrative record regarding with that. You can see that from Tucson and all over, you know, quite a radius, about 60 miles easily, probably 100. We'll always have to deal with these, especially now that we're in the world of solar projects, transmission lines. That could be an audible effect. That's where I've heard that argument, besides being visual. Okay, but we have an adverse effect. we're going to have to continue to resolve, lessen, minimize, or mitigate that effect. And I know a lot of people in Indian country do not like the term mitigate, but that's in it's in the regulations, okay? But I like to always start out with resolving, lessen, minimize. We're not stopping the project, okay? And so everybody knows that, I imagine. So what can we do to make it easier to live with that? It's kind of how I characterize it. Not a very elegant way, but it seems to be effective. Okay, once we come up with something, then we memorialize it, okay, with the Memorandum of Agreement, the MOA. And note that we have a whole list of consulting parties in this regard here, okay? Some individual Indian allottees, as well as the project proponent and the Nevada State Historic Preservation Officer, okay? And this, but this is what ours looks like for the most part. I know I probably have made some comments that people would like to respond to. So this is, the first one is Linda Otero's number that you can feel free to call. No, it's my numbers, okay? My contact. The top one's my desk. The bottom one's my work cell. Feel free to contact me, okay? Yeah, I look forward to listening in on the rest of this. I hope, Valerie, how'd my time go? I work out okay?
Yep, that was just perfect, Gary.
All right, thank you. Good deal.
Thank you for that. That was pretty coherent, all things considered. I'm sorry to hear that you are unwell, and we are sending you best wishes for very mild case and a speedy recovery, full recovery. Gosh, look at that. We have 106 participants. I wish we could see who number 106 was who just joined. We would offer you a discounted registration to something, some kind of door prize. So I did want to highlight that we also have our colleagues, some colleagues from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation with us today. You're seeing Ira light up the chat box here. And I'm not going to put him on the spot. We ideally would love to coordinate with ACHP on offering this webinar, but timing wise, we just decided to go for it. And we're really most excited about our next presentation from the United Auburn Indian Community THPO office. And please keep checking the chat box for comments from Ira for resources. Ira, if there's anything that needs to be clarified from the official perspective, thank you for providing that there for us. So thanks so much, Gary. We're going to turn it over to Rebecca, Matt, and Anna. Are you able to?
Good morning, and thank you. Let me see if I can get my screen shared here. And that should be it. All right. Everyone see that okay?
Very good.
All right. Good morning. I'm Rebecca Allen. I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Director here. Soon you will meet my colleague, Matt Moore, who is the THPO, and the two of us work jointly to oversee our department and report to Tribal Council. We're also lucky enough to have our colleague, Anna Starkey, with us today to talk about rewriting guidelines. This entire presentation we're going to do here came out of some frustration with Section 106 and the process. It's very skewed towards archaeological values and historical architectural values, and tribal values can get put towards identifying traditional cultural properties, but I think many of you who know or have been through the process know that that often just feels like a round peg in a square hole. So we tried to stop and really think about what it is that we would like to get out of the Section 106 process. So we are drafting our own guidelines. We'll share some key points from that today, and we'd love a discussion. We hope to have those guidelines finalized by the end of June or so. And then if there is interest, continue to have the conversation with Valerie and National THPO about maybe making it more generic and just available for everyone. So as you listen to us, we'll start with Anna and then Matt, and I'll wrap up. I really want you to keep these 3 ideas in mind, which is tribal identification, preservation, and restoration. Anna, you want to go next?
Thank you for the introduction, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for joining us during this very important presentation. And I hope you understand what we are trying to explain from our viewpoint. And so I just wanted to start by, Gary did the introduction on Section 106 and my role with the tribe.
Welcome to Zoom. Enter your meeting ID followed by pound.
Was that me? That wasn't me. My primary role with the tribe is to consult under both the federal Section 106 and also the California regulatory.
Enter your participant ID followed by pound. Otherwise, just press.
Which is called CEQA, the California Environmental Protection Act. And it's similar to NHPA, but it's for California. So this kind of came about, the idea started with, like Rebecca suggested, our frustration in consulting with federal agencies under Section 106, that it's kind of been co-opted by archaeological values. And the way that it's written is vague enough that you can be reframed, and that's what we're hoping to show you, can be reframed to really consider the tribal values that can be incorporated instead of just using archaeological values. And this kind of came about. Now, did you guys know that in the Section 106, I went through the entire document and highlighted each instances of the word tribal or tribe, and this is not including THPOs. And there was 161 instances of the word tribe or tribal. There are 0 for archaeology, 2 for archaeological, and 3 for the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. So what does this mean? Why is there so many instances of the word tribe or tribal, but not for archaeology, yet Section 106 just automatically seems like it's for archaeological values? So the Section 106 process strongly emphasizes tribes and tribal values. These values must be weighed appropriately along with archaeological values in the decision-making process. Only tribal members and their representatives can identify tribal values and resources, meaning we don't want to have archaeologists trying to do the identification and evaluation and findings of significance for Indigenous sites. So next slide, please. So we created this document out of frustration and also wanting to share with the people that we consult with what the tribal values are. And again, this is specific for United Auburn Indian community, but I think you can see that the themes may be relevant to tribes in general. So we created this document to assist and inform agencies of the tribal viewpoint, tribal values, and that basically the Section 106 process is not centered on archaeological or historic resources. We want to reclaim the legal right to identify, evaluate, protect, and preserve and restore their ancestors' cultural sites. Next slide, please. I may have skipped a part. We can go back if we want, but that's okay. So this next section, I'm going to just go ahead and read it. Now, these are the types of cultural sites that are more common in California and Northern California. Some of them can be overlapped with other areas. But this is something like the first paragraph I'll read out loud, and this is something that we like to share for like the background sections of these environmental documents. So instead of it just being a copy and paste of the cultural resources section, we like to try to encourage agencies to bring everything into the contemporary tribal values. So that way it has more meaning and is more relevant for the contemporary tribal community. So for Auburn, the interest of United Auburn Indian Community in heritage resource flows from tribal members' inherent connection to their ancestors, their traditional lands, and origin areas. Place or territory is a fundamental component of Indigenous peoplehood, interconnected with language, ceremonial cycles, sacred history, lifeways, and religious expression. UAIC ascribes religious and cultural significance to many cultural and ecological resources, such as, and I provide this list to any, I don't remember if they have this for section 106, but when you have a notice that there's going to be a project, I let agencies know right away. I provide them with this list, like, so that there's no confusion of if a Indigenous site is identified, that is a site that is of religious and cultural significance to the tribe. So there's many different types, like Indigenous archaeological sites. Notice that I do not use the word prehistoric, and I'm hoping that at some point that won't be a terminology that's used in the regulatory context, but that's another discussion. Sacred lands or sites, traditional cultural properties, midden anthropogenic soils, including disturbed soils, because Auburn, we still ascribe significance even if it's in a disturbed state. Most archaeologists, they say it lacks context. So it's not, there's no scientific value, there's no data potential. But from the tribal perspective, disturbed soils is still significant. There's still a sense of place, there's still a site there. Of course, burials, cremations, and all related burial or ceremonial items. Burial soils, because the burial soils still contain the, decomposed elements of, sorry, my dog, elements of people that were there. So burial soils are just as important as the burials themselves. Isolated Indigenous objects, including artifacts, oftentimes archaeologists, they don't ascribe significance to isolated artifacts. Cultural landscapes and topographic features, Indigenous trails, significant native plants and gathering areas, traditional hunting and fishing areas, and waterways associated with landscapes. So I wanted to give a brief example of, I think, I'm not sure, Rebecca, is the next slide for the bedrock mortars, or should we go back one slide? That's for the payment. So go back 2 slides to the bedrock mortar, and other way. I wanted to give a brief example of why it's important that tribes identify archaeological sites. Back to there, one more, there you go. So this is an example of a bedrock mortar. She's grinding acorns here. So in California, bedrock mortars are ubiquitous. I mean, they're very common here. And oftentimes archaeologists will identify a bedrock mortar, and if there's nothing else around, then they'll say it's an isolate and it's not significant. There's a lot of them, there's no significance. So there was a project that Auburn consulted on with the local transportation, or the state's transportation agency. It's called Caltrans. They were doing a highway widening, and there was a bedrock mortar right in the way, and the archaeologists said, oh, it's just an isolate, it can be destroyed. Well, we had a tribal elder go out and look at the bedrock mortar, look at the constituents around it, looked at it, how it is on the landscape. He identified the types of plants that were near the bedrock mortar. He identified a lot of quartz crystals that were near the bedrock mortar, and he determined that no, this is not just a place that processes acorns. This is a doctoring site, and it has significance as a doctoring site. So we were able to show that this bedrock mortar was significant, and it was therefore, it ended up getting avoided completely and saved because we were able to do the identification and evaluation ourselves. So oftentimes archaeologists, they only, or oftentimes for indigenous sites, they primarily ascribe significance under criteria D, as in data potential. And we're able to take that, take the tribal background and the tribal knowledge and evaluate sites oftentimes under all 4 criteria. Now, this is like a little bit longer of a discussion that we won't get into now, but for example, a bedrock mortar, it can be considered like it's a work of a master. It is, that takes a lot of effort to make these mortars. And so you can really use your knowledge, and it takes a little bit of thought process, but you can go beyond just the criteria D. Okay. So next, so one of the things, like what we consider when this is a different side, but I just wanted to add on to that. One of the things that we consider when we try to identify tribal cultural resources or tribal resources, it's not just a single site, like a single isolated site. We include heritage trees because heritage trees have significance to the tribe. We look at how they are in the landscape, and we look how they're associated with any other sites. Like archaeologists will just see a single, draw a circle around something, and is it in or out of the project area, and that's it. But no, what if that site's connected to the larger village site that's right up the hill? So we look at it more, we take a more landscape approach and try to think of it in the larger picture instead of just a dot on the ground. So the next slide, I wanted to briefly talk about why tribal monitors and tribal expertise should be paid. So I'm a former archaeologist, and there was never any question about getting payment to monitor, but it's a real struggle sometimes to try to convince agencies that tribal monitors, they're experts in their field and they're knowledgeable. So tribal monitors are a requirement of the permit, and compensation should be incorporated into project budgets. Tribal monitors are professionals with expertise on tribal resources and should be respected and compensated as such. An archaeological monitor is not a replacement for a tribal monitor if UAIC has identified the project area as sensitive for tribal resources and tribal values. So the advisory council has a section on this that everyone should read. They recently updated their handbook for consultation with Indian tribes in the Section 106 review process. The advisory council strongly encourages agencies to take the steps necessary to facilitate tribal participation in the Section 106 process. Reimbursable costs may include those costs associated with expert consultants, tribes, to identify and evaluate historic properties. This may include field visits to provide information, site monitoring. Sorry, I just got a pop-up and it's blocking the slide. Travel expenses, documentary production costs, and other related investigations. Also, there's an assembly bill that is being proposed here in California. It is called Assembly Bill 2225. And this bill is, it's a policy that will incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into the conservation and management of lands that are owned or managed by the California Natural Resources Agency or their departments, boards, or conservancies or commissions under the California Natural Resources Agency. That is a lot of agencies. So incorporating traditional ecological knowledge, TEK for short, and being paid, the tribes are getting paid for their expertise. And California in particular has, we have to deal with wildfires every year. And I think agencies are waking up going, oh, tribes have this knowledge, they have this understanding how to manage their land. And instead of just taking that knowledge, this bill will compensate tribes for their time. In addition, Caltrans also came out with some guidance documents on reimbursing tribes for their knowledge. So it's becoming a more commonplace and easier to demonstrate, like other large agencies are paying tribes and why it's important. And so hopefully in the near future, it won't be such a struggle. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is when we get notified by an agency that there's an undertaking, we request very specific information. This information will help us gather the information we need and do our background research of the area to identify if there are any tribal resources of cultural and religious significance to the tribe in the project area. So instead of just getting a letter saying, hey, here's a project, here's a map, we request if there's already a cultural report that's been conducted, the biological report and the arborist report. If they don't have them available, then I say, when they are available, please send them my way. I always look at the arborist report to see if there are any heritage trees, because we try to protect heritage trees. And of course, the biological aspect, the plants and the animals, those are also tribal resources. They affect the landscape. So we make sure that we get those reports to review. The lead agency contact information, who am I going to contact to consult on this project? We need to know the maximum depth and the horizontal extent of the soil disturbance, which is very important. And of course, we need to have the project description and the location. And that needs to include everything, the staging areas, any sort of utility improvements. We want to know everything that might be getting disturbed. Shape files of the project footprint. We use an ArcGIS database. And so having these shape files really helps speed up our identification efforts and helps with our personal mappings when we make sensitivity maps. Offsite improvements. A lot of times agencies will just forget to, oh yeah, we're going to actually improve this whole other area over here, but we didn't include it in the project footprint. So always make sure that they're of any offsite improvements. And the last two are also very important. We want to know what their timeline is for their environmental documents. So, we can make sure that we know how much time we have in order to provide comments. And one of the most important one is when is their proposed construction timeline? Oftentimes it's years in advance, but we want to know that because we keep a monitoring database or monitoring log, and we plug in those dates so we know in advance, like any season, like the summer season, how active is it going to be, so we can be adequately prepared with our tribal monitors. So that's all I have for my presentation. Hopefully everyone understood. And if you have any questions, our contact information will be available, and I'll send it to Matthew next. All right, thank you, everyone.
Well, good morning. Matthew Moore, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer with United Auburn. What I'll be going over here is some of the processes and goals from the tribal view and what we've seen from the archaeological side. So for both tribal and archaeological, we really start off with the identification early on. I think when it comes to the archaeological identification, there's a lot of research and background searching, which they're looking into an information system oftentimes, and kind of coming from the outside looking in approach. When the tribes themselves, they actually have much more robust information system on their own, not to mention the oral history that really backs everything that we say. So for us, it's just really, I think it's very advantageous, I can't even talk, advantageous to coordinate with tribes directly instead of kind of duplicating the work for the identification. Since we do have that knowledge internally, it's usually much more robust. For the next step, preservation and evaluation for tribes, it's really critical that they kind of come hand in hand. In the archaeological process, it's just really looking at the evaluation. So for us, the early on preservation approach with evaluation is much more beneficial in the long run, we feel, which next leads to restoration. So for any projects that may have effects, we're looking at how we can restore and kind of keep that landscape to its as close to its indigenous condition or level, even if it is something that's been adversely affected over time, even not associated with the project itself, but trying to get that restoration back to an indigenous state as best as we can. So for the information and data potential in the archaeological side, it's again, it's got to go back to the tribes and getting the information from them instead of really doing record searches and again, like that looking from the outside in. Next slide. And under identification here in this slide, what we're looking at here is under laws is Section 106, which is the federal side. Under NHPA, we have California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. And under CEQA, we have AB 52, which is a state mandate for consultation with tribes. Communication is pretty critical. Planning, well ahead of the projects, actually, well ahead of the planning stages, the design concepts, consulting with tribes and getting ahead of it so that they can bring their information to the table. And if there are any engineering design flaws or things that might affect our sites, we can tackle that very early on so that they can go ahead and make those modifications, hopefully. Meeting with the project managers, engineers again, and the archaeologists is also key for communicating between tribes. Again, early on with these people, it's just so much benefit to both sides when they really understand what they're dealing with and where we're coming from. Oftentimes, sometimes these people really don't get to hear that until it's a little bit too late or further along in the project. With consultation, there's letters to and from agencies. We get the initial notifications, we reply. We usually ask, going by what information we have when we identify these areas, we can go ahead and correspond with the agencies and give them the information the best that we have and continue that consultation, which leads to more meetings or Zoom calls these days. Collaboration to avoid sites, that comes with the more and often consultation that we have. So avoidance is usually our #1 goal, and collaborating with the project proponents and the agencies is really critical if we want to get that accomplished. And with that early consultation, again, listing sacred landscapes and sites with Native American Heritage Commission, that's something that we're really trying to do more and more, as we're seeing as some of these projects are usually are happening a lot of times around our more sacred sites. Unfortunately, for some reason, they're like magnets when it comes to these things. Bridge replacements, for the highway widening, like we mentioned earlier, a lot of infrastructure stuff. We have a lot of levees down here in the valley along our waterways, the rivers. And with those, there's a lot of aerial mounds associated with these levees, because that's what they used to build the levees. They went basically from dot to dot, or site to site, or cemetery to cemetery. So that's how the design of these levees kind of came from. So there's a lot of buried built architecture. Engaging with allies like other tribes and agency people, that's something that we also really heavily encourage. More in our case, the more the other tribes in our area that come together and come to the table, and we can discuss these issues again early. Oftentimes some of these projects, we're beginning our talks before the official consultation begins. So that really helps us kind of get our ducks in a row and all our information correct. And we're ready usually to consult by the time these notifications come through. Report, review, and comment, and more review and comment. We do a lot of that. It's something that we try to keep on top of, that allows us to stay really with our finger on the pulse when it comes to in the field. A lot of these projects, we have so many projects, we have sometimes up to 50 monitors in the field. So we rely heavily on our lead monitors, and they're corresponding with the monitors that are actually out there doing the work. This slide, we're talking about low impact identification efforts. We've been really working a lot with UC Berkeley and a professor that we've been working with. We came up with this kind of a pyramid, and what we see here is a community-based project, and with that we have usually we'd like to go from the notification process to early consultation. Then we try to get our people out and do pedestrian surveys. And that's the tribal monitors that I'm speaking of. I'm getting them out there early, doing surveys, looking at the entire landscape. That has always been my approach, and that's kind of what I've preached to the monitors, is that it's not just the physicality of these sites. There's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot of landscape features that you could clue in on to oftentimes steer you right to the sites that we're dealing with. So it's a very landscape approach. Oral history and archival research is, oftentimes the oral history gets overlooked or disregarded when we present that information to agencies. In archival research, we have really worked a lot to collect and gather all of the information that's out there available to the public and agencies, and bring it internal, so that marries up with everything else that we have as far as the history that we've accumulated internally with our elders, and a lot of interviews and documentation from some of our ancestors and significant people in the past. Traditional ecological knowledge, TEK. That's also kind of ties right into what I was saying, and that's looking at the plants, the animals, everything that really ties everything together in site identification. Land clearing and traditional burning. This is something that we're looking at pretty hard right now since the state of huge fuel loads on our landscape and our forests and the wildfires that we're seeing. We're trying to promote more land clearing and traditional burning around our sites, not just to be used as a new archaeological tool for site identification and or just updating site records. But it's also something that we're also seeing that we believe that will actually kind of improve the ecosystem around our sites too. Traditional burning is, a lot of people think right away it's you're burning trees and everything, which is not true. It's very low impact and low intensity type of burning, so it's not destroying and adversely affecting. It's actually beneficial to the environment. Canine surveys, it's something that if we do find that we have pretty high confidence that there are, say, burials associated in the area, we can bring in canine forensic dogs, which are very, very accurate. And we've had a lot of success in locating and protecting burials that were previously unknown even. Ground penetrating radar, another newer, not so new, but it's probably gaining more popularity within Indian country as far as low impact archaeological tools, which another tool that we've been using a lot more, and it's been very, very successful as well. And then next we can go to magnetometry. That is another layer, I would say, that we could add on top of canine surveys, ground penetrating radar. So the magnetometry would actually bolster and support other evidence that we would be getting. And lastly, of course, in this kind of, you also start with the place knowledge, traditional place knowledge, and you kind of end up back with traditional place knowledge. And it just ties everything all together. All right, preservation. That continued consultation and site identification, anticipated impacts. That's just something that we have to keep doing, keep consulting. It's like kind of sounds repetitive, but it's extremely important that we continue the consultation. A lot of times some agencies feel satisfied with what they've gotten from us and think that maybe, I think we're done consulting now, which is never the case. There's no conclusion to consultation unless the tribes ask for it. So in determining and negotiating mitigation measures when avoidance is not possible, that's something that I always like to talk about, last and not early on. When I hear early mitigation being discussed, and that makes me nervous, and that already raises red flags. The field work, the lead monitor coordinates with construction crews and archaeologists. He's kind of our middleman when it comes to the office and the field work that's going on. He's coordinating with the crews to get construction schedules and anticipating what's coming up next as far as major activity that might be going on a project, different types of ground disturbance. Tribal monitors in the field are critical for us. We train our own monitors. We usually have, anywhere from 25 to 30 people in our monitor training classes every year, and we do it multiple times throughout the year so that they can get the basic training and then move on to more advanced training throughout their monitoring career. And we're always trying to keep it really updated and kind of cutting edge as much as we can so that they're constantly learning and not hearing the same old thing, which makes them better monitors and much more effective in the field. Regular review monitor notes and reporting. That's something that we stay on top of because we got to really see what is going on out there when we're not out there ourselves. And this is all documentation that we rely upon too for our records. Communication Um, like I said earlier, it's always key, collaborate to avoid and preserve in place. You know, it's going to take a lot of communication. People got to be on the same page and they got to understand each other. On-site and in-office meetings to discuss projects and schedules. And oftentimes that's our department and like myself and Rebecca, and not so much our lead monitors, but that sometimes are brought into planning for recovery materials when avoidance is not possible. That takes a lot of communication because there's a lot going on for especially burial recoveries. There's just so much sensitivity and so much respect goes into it. It's something that we don't rush, and we absolutely request that they do so with respect and they take their time and don't make any mistakes or do any more damage. Managing impacts and destruction. Respectful recovery of materials, that's always something that we really heavily influence to these archaeologists when we're recovering material. It may not be a burial sometimes, but those things are associated to people, and you know, a lot of those things we see them as I don't know, like a site. We consider a site as a living thing, and even if the physicality of the site is removed, the site's still there because it's a place. So that never goes away. The same kind of thing with any type of material that we recover. That was somebody's possible personal belongings, or it was something significant possibly, or maybe just things left behind from everyday usage. To us, that's all very, very highly valued, I guess. And we find it sensitive, even though most people don't look at these materials as sensitive, like, if that makes any sense. Promoting tribal monitoring and indigenous archaeology. Back to the pyramid, more less invasive type of technology, less ground disturbance, more involvement with tribes, more tribal monitors involved with the archaeologists as they're doing their work. They should be doing it hand in hand, not like us and them, which is often the case out there. We've been working with better people, archaeologists that are really more tribal friendly, and that's when things really go well for us. Documenting impacts and destruction. Yeah, anything that happens, we're documenting, and you know, we know what that leads sometimes in some of these projects when they don't go so well. So we have to document and you know, just make sure we hold them accountable. And of course, the reporting, the monitors are reporting to the lead monitor reports to us. And then, you know, we're able to report back to the agencies and coordinate. When things are recovered, some archaeologists want to take things away from the site and go to one of their labs or a location where they're going to store. But we don't like that. What we would rather see is things transferred to a lab that the tribe controls. And that gives them the ability to assure that these recovered items and burials are being handled very respectfully and not losing any accountability in the process between going from the field and into the lab, where it's processed for reburial ultimately. Evaluation with tribal values. Here we got the criterion A, B, C, D. So under criterion A, including oral history, information from oral history, as well as published maps. There's a thing right in front of it. Okay. As well as published maps, histories, and other references, events and time periods associated with ancestors are generally important to tribal identity. I had a thought in the back of my head. I'll just keep going to criterion B here. It'll come back. Criterion B, applied in a way that encompasses tribal views of what defines an important person. Associated places with tribal leaders, doctors, healers, spiritual practitioners, and spiritual beings make these places important. Even if the names and individuals and the histories of the people cannot be stated for a non-native audience, from a tribal perspective, the spirit and power of ancestors can remain at the site. And that's what gives it significance. Criterion C, native methods of construction and native forms of architecture are some of the most understudied and recognized of the criteria. There's multiple things, and I think I can probably go back to the levee systems and the burial mounds, and that's exactly what I was kind of referring about, is the construction methods that we had oftentimes aren't recognized as such. And there's a lot of other things besides the burial mounds that were buried into the levees, and some of the roundhouses, some of our village sites. Those are all built environments, and a lot of times those don't get considered as such. They get isolated and pieced out. When you put it all together, it's, see the bigger picture. It's a whole different scenario. Criterion D, we always considered, data potential. Value of information is a mechanism for teaching tribal members, as well as the general public, about tribal culture and heritage. In this way, information is viewed as part of the site's restoration. Okay, for restoration, Indigenous health and healing have traditionally been promoted through land-based ceremony and other practices that support a wider spectrum of wellness, including the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. In restoration, in my mind, a lot of that kind of goes back to bringing back certain activities that have been lost in past decades, from whether it was new laws being put on tribal people, such as burning. This is one of the things that I'm looking at trying to bring back, used as a tool for restoration, and also archaeological reasons, which ultimately really brings back everything else. It's not just about what agencies see as fuel load reduction. We see as restoration, and it's improving the ecology, it's improving biodiversity, plant communities, animal communities, everything that relies on each other for various reasons, but burning's that really one thing that kind of connects it all. And again, that thing's kind of blocking everything.
Yeah, it's restoration up at the top.
Restoration, okay. Focus on restoring integrity. All culturally modified objects and soils are treated appropriately and returned to the sites. A lot of these things are removed from the site, and oftentimes don't get put back where they should be, because agencies tell you that they can't rebury in these locations because of, let's just say it's a levee, can't go back into the levee prism. So we have to find other locations to do our reburials, which makes it kind of complicated at times. Restoration of tribal values and sovereignty, that's just kind of rolls right on into that. What I'm saying, when it comes to how we try to restore in a tribal value kind of way these sites when agencies really deny access. How do we restore these places when we can't put our hands back on it? That's something that we're looking to kind of turn around too, is getting more access so that we can actually help restore some of these places. In reburials, in identification of appropriate areas, that kind of like what I mentioned earlier, that can be difficult to do, but it really puts us in an awkward position as a tribe and as cultural people when we can't put our things back in the appropriate places. So we have to look for other locations. And oftentimes that even leads to discussions with different property owners or sometimes even different agencies. Coordination with an agency and landowner, that is usually kind of the crux of the situation. Either the landowner or the agency are willing or not willing. And that varies, but hopefully, you know, they're all on the same page and they understand the importance of, you know, how we're trying to restore the integrity of our sites when they've been disturbed. And of course, the respectful reburial of everything once it's been removed, documented, reprocessed for reburial, and then reburied. Access and continued stewardship, documentation of the site, which includes technical reports, GIS mapping and the THRIS, which is the Tribal Historic Resource Information System. That's our tribal CRIS, basically. If you're from California, the CRIS system is the information system. Following with the mitigation measures and outcomes, with mitigation measures, I think, you know, we're trying to push more of that non-invasive, low impact archaeological methods and using that as the mitigation, which usually comes to much more positive outcomes. Coordination for the future. You know, what are we going to do once these things are reburied? How are we going to protect these sites and the landscape in the future? And with agencies, sometimes if it's with agencies, there's usually some sort of maintenance plans or general plans that they have to do and update. And, you know, oftentimes we coordinate for or consult on those and try to advise on how they can better maintain their properties and their land and still maintain the integrity of our sites and the landscape. Tribal monitor or staff visits and documentation of conditions. That's also very important, that we kind of continue to monitor the situation or the condition of our sites throughout, you know, the future, and periodically revisiting these places to make sure that nothing's been disturbed or looted or disrespected in any different way. And of course, tribal monitors get often frequent training with the staff. We work together quite a bit and on a daily basis, actually. So we try to do a lot of training together. So we're keeping each other pretty much updated on everything, and which really makes us, you know, a much more efficient department as a whole.
All right.
Thank you.
I'm going to swing the box and the laptop over to me now. And I will say one of the things that I'm an archaeologist by training as well, and an anthropologist. So really listening to Matt and the monitors and realizing that archaeologists talk about disturbance and loss of integrity, and tribal monitors and tribal members really talk about how that sense of place, that traditional sense of place, can be restored following disturbance. And that, I think, is a very different perspective. So Gary mentioned the flow chart, and we did end up redoing that flow chart because we wanted to put tribal concerns front and center. And what we really wanted to emphasize here is consult early, consult often, and then continue to consult towards restoration and after restoration. So I want to break down each of these flows for you so we can all see it a little better as well. With the initiation of the process, I think it's really important to consult with tribes as soon as you can, and also be sure to ask questions about what is the tribal staff time, what is their availability. And I think it's also important for tribes to give that information to agencies. I know there are timelines, but there are some sites that deserve longer timelines. And the earlier that we are communicating with each other about what we can and can't do as individual tribes is really important. If there's, and that often will lead to a pretty quick assessment of whether or not there is an undertaking or whether or not there is a potential to cause effects. If there are, and we both agree that an undertaking may affect historic properties, we really want to make sure there's tribal participation in that identification. I've seen too often in my career that going to excavation, going to testing happens pretty quickly when there's really a moment to pause and think about all these non-invasive ways of identifying what a site is. And while you're doing the identification, you also have that moment to explore preservation, meet with the project engineers, meet with the project managers, as well as the archaeologists, to begin to talk about if you can reroute, if you can avoid. And I would say we've been able to avoid probably 50 to 60% of the times. I'd like to see it more, but there's always, we're getting better at this. And then evaluate with the tribal values, as well as any historic or archaeological or architectural values, that really that evaluation needs to be a conversation, and rather than the agency deciding it, it needs to be a collaboration so that all parties agree. If it's usually public safety is something we have to consider. Matt mentioned the levees. Flooding is a real danger in Sacramento and the Placer County area, as is fire. So we really try to work with agencies to assess effects when we can't avoid them. But as the process unfolds, as the conversations unfurl, we really, we can often collaborate to minimize those effects in any case. And if we still are in a position where properties are going to be affected, then that's when we begin to talk about mitigation. And that's also really important for us to talk with the agency about what the restoration steps will be. How do we return that sense of place? What physical actions need to happen, as well as ceremonial actions that need to happen to restore that place. And if the parties are able to agree on a solution and restoration is achieved, Gary mentioned the memorandum of agreement. We find those to be very important. And often, I think in this gray box here, you will see processes concluded. And we're still wrestling with what we want to put in the box here, because we realize that what we really want to happen after that is continued collaboration, continued access in many cases, and continued conversation to talk about what's best for the resource itself. And of course, if there's no agreement, there are, the advisory council can comment, our councils can comment, and tribes may want to pursue additional actions. And we usually, we try to avoid the not coming to agreement, because then we end up with a very mad Matt, and no one likes that. And thank you all for listening. I know we've been talking a lot of things that it's a different process. It's one that puts tribal conversations and values in the center, rather than the one box up on the left that says you may want to consult interested parties. But we found that laying this process out for ourselves and for our agencies has really led to a lot better outcomes. So thank you. And thank you, Valerie, for the invitation to come and talk with you all.
Thanks, Rebecca and Matt and Anna. That was that was wonderful. I've been seeing some questions in the chat box here, and thank you, Anna, for addressing some of those, and Eric for putting some resources in there as well. Rebecca and Matt, I know that you guys were talking, but if you might be able to review the chat box for us and see if there's any additional answers you'd like to provide, that would be great. I'm going to take a moment and ask if there are any direct questions for the United Auburn folks before we turn it over to Jill and Nick. And it looks like we're going to go a little bit past 3 today, which is okay with me. And to reiterate that we are recording this, and then we'll conclude with our video from Mary. And we had hoped for some additional question and answer discussion period. So if folks can stay on, we will keep the line open as long as we can. Are there questions for the United Auburn folks? You guys want feedback? You want input on this draft? Can you put email address in the chat box?
Very much so. This is when you try and recreate guidelines, you try to think of everything, and then of course you don't. So having your perspectives and having more resources is very important. And I did look at the chat quickly and see that Anna, as often, she is ahead of me and has answered those questions really well. And the professor that we're working with at UC Berkeley, his name is June, short for Kojun, Jun Sunseri. He's an associate professor at Berkeley. We also are working with Kent Lightfoot in the same department, as well as Peter Nelson, who is a Grayton Rancheria tribal member and now an assistant professor at Berkeley in their environmental office.
Okay, thank you. And Rebecca, can you put an email address in the chat box where you would like questions, comments, feedback sent?
Yes, thank you.
Do you have a time frame?
We're really trying to wrap this up by the end of June. So if you don't have time to put things in writing, please give me a call or email me, and we'll set up a time to chat, because sometimes just chatting through things is really helpful too. So within the next few weeks, by June 15th or so, it'd be really good to have comments, and I'd appreciate that.
Okay, thank you all for sharing that. It's amazing to see the work that must have gone into that and the years of experience that guidance represents. It's really cool. All right, Jill and Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you for some pro tips from your perspectives and experience.
Pro tips. I'm glad we went back to pro tips. I saw the topic thing. I'm like, key points, but I just want to second everything everybody said so far. And hopefully Nicholas has his camera on. I can't see. He is the new deputy THPO here. So you have 100% of the THPO office staff on this training right now. That's one of the different challenges we have here. So you just heard from a group that's got some staff, can field monitors and run a contracting and whatnot. We currently can't. And also you guys are more urban. So everything you said, but we're in North Idaho in the Panhandle. And I am from Iowa. I am a settler colonial transplant and a recovering academic. It's got a 13th step down off the high horse when you get out of academia. It's very, very different. And a background in language, anthropology, all of that. Nicholas, if you're there, wave, is a tribe member, and when I'll pass it to him shortly, hopefully, and he can introduce himself a little better. Coming into this from a very different angle. So I'm coming up on 18 years with the tribe, I think 16 as a THPO, and it's all been an accident and a lovely one. So key points, when I came into this, had to hit the ground running and actually write the THPO grant proposal or THPO proposal with tribe members and others and get through the NPS system and, get THPO'd, as we're saying. Now we talk about THPOing, and I know that makes Valerie and Julie and Melissa giggle, but we've verbified it. So in doing that, one of the early things I heard, I think it was one of the Windy boys out of Montana said, I've been doing this for over a decade and it's crisis management. And that is true. We get an onslaught when there was ARPA funds, now there was TARP funds, now there's the CARE funds, everything becomes a federal project, the federal trigger, and you just get an onslaught of stuff. And no, I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm working off paper and pencil. So the number one thing I learned early on when they made me be THPO was to triage what's coming in. We're near Spokane, Washington. It's part of the traditional territory. If there is a cell tower going on an existing tower on top of a water tower, we'll let that go, or I'll call up Randy or email Randy over at the Spokane tribe, their THPO, and say, are you on this? Keep us posted, kind of sort out what has to be done and what doesn't have to be done. Meanwhile, we have something going in just yesterday up the St. Joseph River, which obviously renamed by the settlers. That's really important area to the tribe. We've got just this massive influx of people from Matt and y'all's area coming up to North Idaho to try to get away from diversity and not wear their masks. So we have this big new population up here, and they like their boats. They want to put them in. The guy was dredging. He got caught. But it's a sacred area and it has a lot of stuff going on. So the first thing we do here is what is going to stop this before we have to deal with cultural resources. We're in an area where we can't really trust any developers or individuals who aren't tribe members to keep anything confidential. So we're on a Zoom meeting yesterday, and he's like, oh, we'll just talk in generalities and you tell us. And my skill, the reason the tribe hired me is I go, no. And it looks like the tribe's recreation program is going to be able to give this guy a hard no. So we're not going to share any cultural info. And when it comes to agencies, kind of the same thing. We try to make sure that we know our agency staff, and we've had a huge amount of turnover, and educate them. So we are poaching the United Auburn flow chart and tweaking it for here. Thank you so much. I heard about it on our pre-meeting. It's wonderful. But knowing our agency staff and educating them, and a lot of that will be Nick's portion here. He's such a good educator. And who sort of you can trust, and understanding that confidentiality can get breached when the next person comes in. We just had the Army Corps accidentally okay something on the reservation where they didn't have the right to okay it and have to back that up. And that's how we landed on the bad meeting yesterday. And she apologized, but there you go. And early on in my career as THPO, I wrote something saying, no, this developer can't have this, to the Army Corps. And the colonel at the time didn't read it, but was on his way to vacation and shared it straight across to the developer. And so they had something on a tribe document with a tribe official name saying, make sure the developer doesn't see this, but here's all the good info. And apologies don't fix that. Apologies do not fix that. It happens. So we're very careful what we share. And part of that might be North Idaho. I'm sure you've all heard about us and the racist problems up here. It's part of what I studied for my PhD. So know your staff, know your area. Rural is going to be different than urban areas. This is what I would call a medium-sized reservation, but maybe it's bigger elsewhere. And then consulting off-res is a little different than consulting on-res. And one thing that piqued Valerie's interest, she's like, how do you keep all the words straight, like mitigation, minimization? Do you have an adverse effect? And I literally, PhD or no, keep something like this posted next to me with my keywords. Because when I'm using them with agency staff, tribe members, tribe government, I use them one way. But when you're writing the letter, it's a legal document, it's binding. And so, it's hard to back that up. So I try to make sure I'm using the terms as they are used professionally. I know in my personal life, I'm like, oh, I'll mitigate this, meaning I'll lessen it. but that's minimized legally. And also make sure you, in our area, or, you know, where I work, we do government to government and try to stick really clearly to that. And as the home of, Nick and I were trying to decide if it's the biggest or second biggest Superfund site in North America, we got to keep our lead agency straight. Is it the EPA or is it the landowner, which is often the Forest Service or the BLM on one of their cleanup projects? Just to make sure we're working with the people who have the authority to make the agreements and change the project. So careful what you share, careful who you're talking to. And when I first started with the Coeur d'Alene tribe, and every tribe and agency will be different, they warned me to keep the word draft on everything until it's ultimately final, to be sure and track. You know, if you're negotiating with an agency talking about MOUs, I watermark it draft so that they can't pull it out years down the road when we've forgotten. And say, well, that was the final, that was our agreement. And then what I'm currently sort of working on, because I do have a background in linguistics, it's my favorite part of anthropology, is I've noticed, like, I have to do English to English translations. When Nicholas came on, thanks for turning your camera on, Nick, he's got a forestry background with the tribe. I poached him from there, and they're still a little mad at me for taking their best guy, but had the interest to come over here. He started talking about old growth, and we have ancient trees. You know, this is a cedar culture and giant trees are important. Found out with the Forest Service, what was that, Nick, like 70 years old, they consider old or ancient?
Yeah, 40 inches DBH, which you need at least a 70-inch DBH to build a canoe.
Yeah, so when I was representing the tribe and saying we need more old growth, we need to protect this, the people I was talking to had a very different idea of what old growth was, and I'm trying to be more aware. And one word or several here that have been real struggles, and I'm still working on, and if any other THPOs, tribes, government staff, whatever, have input, it would help me. Tribes appeal to sacred sites, sacred things. My people, the white colonialists, don't have a good concept of the sacred. The way I grew up, it's mobile, it's temporary. The priest or minister can sanctify something and then desanctify it. I mean, I'm a minister off the internet because I wanted to marry my friend, so technically I can sanctify you. But then it can be unsacredified. And most of the world is profane. And the Coeur d'Alene are still, in their traditional language, are on their Garden of Eden. This is where the Creator made and makes them. And everything is in the process of becoming and is sacred. So the idea that sacred is the isolated temporary thing is very, very different. Or like, well, you can bulldoze a church and build a new one, or you can turn the old bowling alley into a church, which did happen up in the city of Coeur d'Alene. That's not a thing for the tribe. And that's really hard to get across. And I end up appealing to things with agencies saying like, well, is this something you'd be happy to do on Arlington National Cemetery, right on top of the grave of the unknown soldier? Would this be awesome there? Because we get things like, well, we're avoiding the sacred site by 200 yards, so it's good. Or we're avoiding it sometimes by 1 foot. We miss the arrowhead, that archaeology bias, you know, so it's fine. And the other term I'm battling right now is the idea of a natural resource and resource extraction, the idea of profit, you know, economy. And tribe members who've joined the department and are now my bosses, which is cool, are introducing me to the idea that everything is a gift from your mother. And Nick talks about relatives and the idea that traditional language and the way tribe members use English is very different in conceptualizing plants, natural entities, parts of the landscape as the same. In English, it's othered. It's a different pronoun. And in Coeur d'Alene language, many indigenous languages, things use the same pronouns as humans. It's not a divide. That's not a separation. So even communicating in English amongst tribe members, agencies, and other THPOs gets to be really challenging. And I'm trying to be aware of that and super careful of my use of language. So Nick, if you want to talk about your perspectives and your educational stuff that you've really upped, and your, I don't know, all your projects you're on that will help people.
Okay, just a moment. Okay, let's see if this works here. Can y'all see that? Okay, so one of the first things I like to do when I talk to agencies is I like to talk to them about the creation of Indian law in this country. And Indian law was created, the basis of Indian law, the initial 3 cases were done by the first Chief Justice, John Marshall. And in those cases, he referenced what were known as papal bulls. And they are statements by the Pope, by the Catholic Church, and they were assumed into this country's lawmaking process. And so right from the very beginning, if you read the language on there, you can see how inherently racist Indian law is in this country. It wasn't meant for us. I really suggest you watch this movie by Mark Charles if you haven't already. And part of the thing that I like to do with agencies is to educate them on history, the history of people. Almost every tribe has a removal story, some more extreme than others. The most widely known is probably the Trail of Tears. Everybody knows about that. But something that people don't know is that basically every tribe was removed in some type of way from their landscape. And even if they still remain on their original territories, people do not know about allotment and how it affects various tribes. So you see here, we have the Coeur d'Alene tribe's Aboriginal territory. It spans Washington, Montana, most of the Panhandle. And I'm not sure if you can see my mouse on there, but we had an original treaty proposed that enveloped all of Lake Coeur d'Alene. And that was not to be. Senator Hayburn got together with President Taft, and they realized that if the Coeur d'Alene tribe controlled the lake, that we would control their access to mining. And so what they did here is they made a cutoff line right at this certain town called Harrison. And that is what they used as the shipping point to poison our Lake Coeur d'Alene and make it the Superfund site that it is today. And people like to cite Indians getting free money, and oftentimes people do not even know about their own history. Here's another thing I'm going to share, and it's on the city of Harrison, Idaho's website. And it states, Harrison developed from a squatter's homestead to a thriving village in about 12 years. And what they failed to mention is that the Army was forcibly removing Indians from the area. Indians would be shot on sight. This happened nationwide. And see, a lot of these agencies, they may have grown up here. Their great-grandpa lived here. But great-grandpa probably never talked about the genocide. It's shameful. Why would you want to talk about it when you have a proud colonial legacy to stand behind? You know, and so part of getting agencies to understand why these things are so sacred to us and why they matter so much is making them understand the hidden history of this country. This country was inspiration for Nazi Germany. Hitler himself said it. And the amount of nationalism here, it's toxic to tribal sovereignty. And it's my point of view that all reservations are TCPs. If you look at the criterion, it's a very significant event in time in history. And I really appreciate the previous presentations talking about restoration and advancing sovereignty, you know, beyond the reservation system. There was allotment, and I don't know what it did to other tribes, but to our tribe, it brought our land ownership to less than 10% within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. And that is part of restoring our sovereignty, is taking that land back and putting it into its former state. Our whole reservation was drain tiled by the farming advocacy that the United States government forced upon our people when they outlawed hunting on the reservation, and they forced us to go to the BIA man every year. And oftentimes the agencies you're talking to, they have not educated themselves on this. And it's up to us to represent our people and inform people of the history, and to help them understand that supporting tribal sovereignty is correcting these historical traumas that were inflicted upon our people by the US government. And so also, one of the things that really frustrates me when dealing with agencies, take the Corps of Engineers, for example, they like to list it as a treatment on a landscape when they take a boatload of elders out to a site and they go for a day trip. You know, the fact of the matter is that it's our ancestors that created these sites, and a quick day trip is not a treatment. When you're dealing with people, ask for that land back. That's a treatment. Put your people back where they belong. That's a treatment. I was kind of just winging it here, and you know, that's all I got.
You're good at winging it. That's why I stole you from forestry. But yeah, having smart people who can think on their feet, I highly recommend hiring them for your THPO program. And younger than you. So yeah, and I think the idea of, you know, getting people back on the land, it was talked about as restoration, preservation in other areas, and sometimes agency folks will think of a reservation in the way that my relatives back in Iowa do, where they don't have experience of it, as a place that truly was reserved and only tribe people can be there and are there. And this reservation, the last census I looked at, is 82% non-Indigenous. And more than half the tribe, you know, lives off reservation. So it takes work to get all the ducks in a row. And I really appreciated all the comments from United Auburn staff and others about being sure to do your ethnography, your document, your archive research, your non-invasive stuff. And then we're also trying to go with this Superfund cleanup and the forestry, you know, really pushing, like, look at this traditional burn. And we haven't talked to United Auburn about this, but a lot of THPOs come to this on their own. A lot of tribes come to it individually that look at traditional ways of land management in these times of crisis. With the Superfund cleanup, it's for heavy metals from mining. So we have to be fully HAZWOPER'd and put our own health at risk to do our jobs up here. And I know that's true for a lot of tribes and other groups. But it also means, you know, let's look at things other than just trying to bury it and seal it with concrete. I know that's the old white people way of doing stuff, but we're looking at, you know, can we do plant mitigation, phyto mitigation, things that are more natural, less invasive, even for the projects. Sometimes the projects don't have to be as invasive on things as dramatic as mine cleanup. So yeah, I really appreciate hearing all the creative ways people are doing this. These trainings, I think, are as beneficial for the participants as they are for the attendees. So thank you again to Valerie and everybody for setting it up. And unless you have more, Nick, Coeur d'Alene Tribes Cheats Oomph will check out and continue listening.
Lim Limps for your time.
Jill and Nick, thanks so much. That was really informative. I do want to show Mary's video, and I think we have a question for you, Nick, in the chat box. Who was the video by? I'm assuming that's the one that you mentioned.
Yeah, it's a YouTube by Mark Charles titled "We the People." Let's see here.
Thanks for that. And here's a link to that. Thank you. Before I show Mary's video with some key points about NHPA related to this that she wanted to share with you all, are there any questions for our panelists? Trying to be mindful of the time here. feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, put something in the chat box. We have quite an assemblage of expertise and experience here. Just checking for hands. No questions? Was that a fire hydrant of information? All righty. Well, we will be sure to put contact information for all of our panelists in a slide when we put the information, the recording on the link to the recording on our website afterward. Okay. Thank you to our panelists today. We are so grateful for all of you taking time out of your tremendously busy schedules to come and share your perspectives and expertise and experience with us. I think this is among the most important work that NATHPO can be doing, frankly, is connecting people with questions to people with answers. And so we're grateful for everyone taking the time to come today, both to speak and to listen and to exchange information with each other. And thanks, Jill, for putting your contact information in the chat box there. I'm going to try to show this video.
Valerie, quickly, there was a question in the chat from Mary. Does anyone have draft letters they could share when they respond to Section 106 requests?
It depends on what kind of the project is, and if you have like a specific project, we try not to over template our letters. And again, as Jill pointed out, we are a well-staffed office here. But if you are looking for a particular kind of letter or content, please contact Anna, and she'll be happy to share that with you.
I will just quickly add that once we worked from home when the pandemic started a couple years ago, we stopped sending letters, and I primarily respond to letters through email. So most of my consulting, at least the initiation of it after we receive notification, is all done through email. And that way each email is personalized to each project, and they're very short and quick. I'm happy to provide examples, and also our Section 106 mitigation measures for post-review discoveries and monitors. So I'm happy to share my contact information is in the chat. We can share it again, and I'm happy to share anything that we have if anyone is interested. Thanks.
And this is a question that we get at NATHPO too. We ideally would love to be a clearinghouse of information like this on our website. It's remained on our list. So if anyone does have any letters that they would like to make available through the NATHPO website, just as a FYI, then please let us know, send them to us, and we can create a page for that. It's definitely sort of a running task that we have as far as compiling resources and sharing those in that way. And there's Melissa's information in the chat box there too.
Valerie, I did add in the chat box our language for the significance of heritage trees. So it's a pretty, I mean, it does have UAIC mentioned it by name, but that could easily be removed and used. It can be used for any tribes that have hold significance for heritage trees. So I would assume that would be perfectly fine to share.
Okay.
Yeah, because they are important and often overlooked. So.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to play this video by Mary, who is not here with us today to take any questions about it, but we can put her email address in the chat box in case you would like to follow up with her offline as well. Final reminder that this is being recorded, so if you have to jump, look out for the link and you can tune into this the next time you have a break. I see a raised hand by Larry. Can you unmute yourself if you have a question?
There we go. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. Hey, I just had a question because here in South Dakota, you know, in California, you have the AB 52, which is great for the notifications by anybody that's going to be doing any kind of ground disturbances, you know, having to meet the CEQA requirements. So over here in South Dakota, one of the things we don't have is we don't have any regulations for any kind of work that's going to be done here. So my question to the panelists, anybody that's on here, is with regards to notifications of projects that are going on other than the Section 106, are there any requirements or are there any ways that we can have notification to these projects that fall within the treaty boundaries, such as the Fort Laramie Treaty? So right here in South Dakota, where I'm at, I'm within the Fort Laramie Treaty, and there's a lot of construction going on, a lot of new housing developed, a lot of new roads going in. And when I went down to the county to see if we can get some notification for you know, monitoring, you know, things like that, there was no, they didn't have to notify, there was no requirements for them to one, to notify us, and two, to have us be on site to monitor any of the projects. Has anybody had any experience within these boundaries, within these treaty boundaries, where we can have you know, notifications from the, I guess, you know, I know that like Army Corps of Engineers, you know, that they have some guidelines that they're required to notify local tribes, but you know, because I'm coming new to this area, and what I've been finding is a lot of there's just no regulations for any consultations. So I'd like to, you know, just if anybody has any experience with dealing with within the treaty boundaries, if there's any kind of notifications or advice that you can give me.
I have a similar situation. This is Jill up in North Idaho, because they're Washington State. I'm pointing at it. That's not helpful to you. Has a SEPA, a State Environmental Protection Act, so we get notices there. But right here, we're on the border. You know, it's a skinny area up in the Panhandle. In Idaho, there is no state trigger other than burials of any kind are considered graves, and rock shelters. Otherwise, there is no state or local requirement for anyone to notify. There's no trigger, no right, and they don't have to pay. I find out by keeping up on the local newspapers, driving around with eyeballs peeled, and coordinating with things like I said, our recreation department for the tribe will sometimes get a notice because of the river, or our forestry department, having been out and about, will be aware of what's going on off reservation. Their contractors for logging here will let them know. So it's all been informal. The problem with 106 is it's a federal trigger. When there's no federal, there's nothing. NRCS, because I believe you're in an ag type area or grazing, Natural Resource Conservation Service will have some stuff. And I forget who owns a lot of land there, maybe BLM. But NRCS does a lot of little projects like gully plugs in fields, erosion management, and they tend to use here paraprofessionals to do their archaeology, which means the guy in their office who's doing the permit, or lady, is the one who will walk around and go, oh yeah, no archaeology, off you go. And then just declare it no effect or no whatever and forget to notify. But those sort of, sorry guys, lesser known federal agencies, not lesser, but lesser known, will sometimes be funding ag. And we're also looking into, and Nick had to run down the hall and deal with something else, looking at how we can consider, shoot, what do you call it? I'm from Iowa. The ag support stuff, the payments that farmers get for growing stuff or not growing stuff. How's bad to
Subsidies?
get old? Pardon?
Subsidies?
Subsidies. Yay. I'm losing my words. I already lost my religion. Words are what's left. So maybe farm subsidies, because farming is a major impact on cultural resource, traditional territories, and then these checkerboarded reservations. We're finding that realtors and governments that are not the tribe are saying, well, if it's owned by a white person in fee or a non-tribal member in fee, here it's mostly white, then it's not the res and we don't have to do it. And state parks on the reservation will forget that inside the exterior boundaries, regardless of ownership, it is tribe. So if there's any micro federal trigger, we're trying to find ways to work with that. But it is just plain hard, and I find out about a lot of stuff by driving around and reading the local paper. So that's all I got.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I've been doing, is
Yep.
driving around and seeing all this now. But
you may not have a lever to stop or do anything,
right,
or get paid for monitoring. We just don't. We just drive and go on site, and I wear an orange vest and carry a metal forms protector clipboard and just look official and just go do it. So far I haven't been shot at, but it's gonna happen.
So in one of the questions I have is that, within every treaty that's been has been made and then broke, but within that boundary, my question would be, wouldn't that be a federal trigger already, because it is a treaty, it's the boundary, like this area right here. But what I've been finding out is that for some reason, even though it is a treaty boundary, there's no trigger that that mandates that they consult with the local tribe. And this whole area, even where I'm living right now, is a sacred land, but yet there's no requirement mandate for any, company to come in and consult. So that's my main concern. Is I just wanted to find out if there was any people, any organizations out there that have dealt with this before, because it is a big, it's just mind blowing that they can come in and just start digging up wherever they want, and this is this is a treaty boundary, yet there's no mandate. So that's just kind of where I'm getting at. I just want to have some sort of backup, some sort of because I know the language in the treaties are really vague. So when you come to today's language, it's manipulated so bad that you don't know what you can use, because there's just so much. The terminology back then was just so vague. But anyway, my real question here is if there's anyone that has dealt with the inside the treaty boundaries dealing with these. So that again, that's what I'm looking for. Just help on that. But thank you. No, that's good.
If you find triggers, let us know.
Yeah, for sure.
I would say that the California law, and it really did take legislation to change things, but that law came about because of conversations between the state historic preservation officer, who started to ally with some of the environmental firms, and just have those hard conversations. I know the situation is much different where you are, but if there's any potential or possibility for legislation, I think that's has to be one of the answers. And I probably just frustrated you by saying that, but I think it does. That's a very hard one, and I'm sorry that you are put in that position too often.
Larry, do you
Oh,
want to
that-
put your email in the chat box and then somebody can get with you?
Oh, yeah, great point. Yeah, because when I came out here, I was a THPO in California. Then when I came out here, boom, I just a brick wall, so I appreciate, you're right, and you're right with the legislation, because that's exactly what has to happen. And when I went to Peer to actually, kind of and try to get this going, again, there was some backlash, but we're trying, and I think, and it is, Rebecca, you're right, it is legislation that's gonna ultimately change this. So I'll go ahead and put this email in there, and thanks for all your input.
Okay, thanks, Larry. Jill, Rebecca. Share sound. See if I can.
Hi, my name is Mary Barger, and I'm an archaeologist with Logan Simpson. I'm a retired federal archaeologist. I have 37 years in with the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, and Western Area Power Administration. And with Western Area Power Administration, I was the federal preservation officer. I primarily did the National Historic Preservation Act, but I started doing a lot more NHPA towards the end. So I'm going to address NHPA and some issues with the National Historic Preservation Act. Here's an example of a NHPA project. It's a veg management project on a major transmission line in California. And this was an environmental assessment for modifying an existing cell tower by raising it and adding dishes. NHPA has 3 levels of evaluation: categorical exclusions, or CEs, CXs, or CATXs, depending what agency you're working with, EAs, and EISs. So for CATXs, they are excluded from additional NHPA review. That's their definition. And each agency has a list of approved CATXs, and you can access that list if you're curious. And it's a CATX unless extraordinary circumstances apply. So extraordinary circumstances, what is that? That means, is it an undertaking under the National Historic Preservation Act whereby it would impact an historic resource, historic property, or historic resource? Endangered species applies similarly under extraordinary circumstances. So then Section 106 applies. It can still be a CATX. There's no public input for CATXs, but when Section 106 applies, you would be contacted under National Historic Preservation Act. The agency does have to make CATXs available to the public. You just have to ask for them. EAs are any project that's not on the list of approved CATXs and is not an EIS. Public participation is encouraged but not required, so don't be surprised if your agency has an EA and they don't even contact you under NHPA. Most take 6 months to a year to prepare, and they end with either a finding of no significant impact, a FONSI, or preparing an EIS. An adverse effect to historic properties does not require an EIS. Many people believe that. In fact, I used to, but it's not a requirement. Section 106 is done during EAs, so you would be contacted and consulted on during the environmental assessment, but only under Section 106 should the agency decide not to do public participation. EISs are more complex, and public concerns are expected. They can take 1 to 5 years to complete. Section 106 is done. Public participation is part of NHPA scoping. So that's those scoping meetings where they notify you. And tribal consultation is a required part of NHPA and Section 106 in EISs. So the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation and the Council on Environmental Quality decided to come up with guidance on how to combine NHPA and Section 106. If you do that, the agency has to notify the SHPO or THPO. And one of the places where it's combined is public scoping is perceived of as meeting consultation requirements. So you can imagine how maybe that's not the best way to consult is through public scoping. Plus, the NHPA study area has to match the area of potential effect, and that doesn't always happen. Agencies sometimes are aware of a NHPA action prior to starting the process, but they don't notify anyone. And this is normal because a lot of proponents or stakeholders come in and propose a project that's not viable. So they already know they're not going to do NHPA. But in other cases, they're aware of a big project coming. They may not know when, but they do know it's coming, but they still don't notify the tribes. And waiting for that to start, waiting for NHPA to start takes tribes out of any early involvement or consultation efforts. When a tribe receives a letter for consultation or public scoping, so you've seen those letters, they invite you to public scoping meetings. If you can't make the public scoping meetings, you can request that they give a presentation to tribal council or to your cultural group or biology group, anybody you want. Do this in writing on letterhead and CC the SHPO and the advisory council. You can also ask for an extension for any reviews. If you can't make that 30, 45, or 60-day review, ask for an extension. Do this in writing, same way, CC SHPO and the advisory council. Many people think that they're going to comment on the draft EIS and make a difference. That's too late. It's way too late. So if you comment during the draft EIS, the only thing that happens is your comments get addressed in the final EIS. There will be no change to the project. I'm only aware of a change from this happening once in all of my years of working. And it was because the tribes joined together and contacted congressmen, senators, and the White House. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. Even before the notice of intent to prepare an EIS is published in the Federal Register, sometimes the proponent starts doing field inventories. So they may be in the field when they come in to talk to the federal agency, or they may have already completed them. And that's for cultural and biological. So this is obviously an APE issue because the agency didn't decide the APE and tribal participation didn't happen. I like to review EAs and EISs. I always think it's very interesting to see how they address issues and how they don't address issues. So you should always ensure the APE is adequate for the project's effects. For example, visual, what's the height of the project? Many EISs and EAs don't really give you the height, the highest point on any of the projects. Look for the project description to see if the APE works for it. For example, is the right-of-way wide enough to accommodate heavy equipment turnarounds, like for a flatbed carrying a transmission line pole? Is the road, does the road need to be improved? Where are they going to get the gravel to improve the road? Always look at the biological section. I always do, because it's sometimes a better description of the project area and the area that could be impacted. Also, the biology mitigation areas may be outside of our APE, and you're not going to know that if you don't read the biology section. Biology resources are always of interest to the tribe, so again, take a look at that. Springs and water sources can be sacred, so take a look at the hydrology or the water section to see if they've addressed any concerns you might have. One of the best things you could do is ask for a field visit to see the project. Ask that project proponent people are there to answer questions because the agency cannot. If you have people that can't make it to the field, videotape it and take it back to your elders or to your tribal council. If your tribe has different divisions that should be involved, tell the agency, for example, natural resources, biology, hydrology. So they may need to come for multiple meetings with different advisory groups at your tribe. So ask the agency to do that, do it in writing. So one of the most important sections is alternatives. In public scoping, they'll start talking about alternatives. And this is the point during public scoping where if you want to provide an alternative, you should do that. I worked on a project where the agency had 5 alternatives and they actually had a preferred alternative in mind. And one of the stakeholders made a presentation on a completely different alternative, which shocked the agency, by the way. And it turned out in the end, that alternative was this preferred alternative with some minor modifications. That was the only time I've ever seen it happen, but it taught me a lesson that during public scoping, if you want to change your project, you need to propose an alternative in writing with a map. If you want to move that transmission line, propose it on a map. And do not propose no action as an alternative because that's already a legal requirement. If you want a visual simulation of the project because you think it could affect traditional use areas or sacred sites, be sure to request that. You don't have to give the exact locations. NHPA addresses resources that are not addressed during the National Historic Preservation Act. So this is important that NHPA addresses traditional use areas and collection sites, not Section 106. So that'll be in a different part of the EIS or the EA. So be sure to look for that. Don't forget the project proponents pressuring the agency to hurry up. Time is money, hurry it up. And those meetings are terrible. I've been in them. I've been on conference calls with project proponents and it's harrying and it's difficult. The agency also reports to Washington, D.C. on progress on the EIS. So there's also pressure on the agency from D.C. When you write letters to the agency, copy SHPO and the advisory council. And if you think it'll help other supportive tribes and as necessary, congressmen, senators, and the secretaries of the agency with whom you're working, for example, Agriculture's Forest Service, Interior's BLM, and WAPA and FERC or Energy. If you think there's ethnographic resources that could be affected, even if you're not sure, ask the agency to hire an ethnographer. Just make sure you approve the ethnographer that they select. If there's a programmatic agreement or a memorandum of agreement for the project and you choose not to sign thinking that'll stop the project, it won't. That won't have anything to do with it. The project will still be implemented. And if you're not a full signatory, the and have the opportunity to review and comment on them. I hope this was helpful. And if you have any questions, please ask the team or Gary Cantley, who knows everything. Thank you.
There you go. It's official. Just ask Gary. All right, well, that concludes our formal programming today. Wow, we had a lot of folks stay with us. We appreciate that. I just want to say thank you again to all of our panelists, to everyone who put so much work every day, heart and soul, into protecting Native places and doing the work that you do. It is an honor and a pleasure to be able to serve you, and we hope that this was useful as well as entertaining. And if you missed anything, again, we will provide the link to the recording imminently, and you have a great collection of contact information here to be able to follow up with our experts offline. They are more than happy to talk to you and answer any specific questions that you might have. We've had lots of opportunities for comments and questions today. Seeing some more come along in the chat box here. Thanks, Melissa. This was where you can find the link afterward. Lots of information to process. We have sent you the draft document that the United Auburn folks are working on. Please be sure and check that out and provide any feedback to those good folks on your own time. And we will continue to consider and discuss how we may be able to either just offer a final version of that or hold future events to see what might be possible in the way of a nationwide resource or template that would be helpful on that front. And again, as a reminder, our next event will be June 8th. That will be another webinar. Speaking of templates, we will be hosting the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, Community of Oregon, THPO office to walk through a template for tribal data collection that will be hopefully a useful resource for THPOs to go and collect their own information, characterize their own landscapes as they're able, and then have that information on hand to be able to talk about it to agencies and consultants in ways that are appropriate to the tribe in advance of proposed undertakings. And then our Sacred Places Summit will be virtual this year, September 21st and 22nd. And please check our website for more information on those as they develop. Thank you everyone for tuning in today, for taking the time, for doing the work that you do. Please stay safe out there and take good care. We will see you next time.